Welcome back to History 101. My name is Christina Paris. I'm your instructor for this course, and we are going to be covering Chapter 17, The Culture and Politics of Industrial America, 1870 to 1892. This will be part one of the lecture. We've been dividing the chapters up into multiple parts. I hope this is working for you. I know the parts are really long. I know you don't have to listen to all the parts, but hopefully this helps prepare you for the quizzes and helps you understand the content a little better. So we'll go ahead and start this part of the chapter. So we open up, as we always do with each of these chapters, with an American portrait. This time it's Luna Kelly and the Farmers Alliance. Now Luna Kelly, she was a farmer's wife. She had always dreamed of living life on a farm, but she found that the life was a bit challenging being a farmer's wife. I don't know if you've ever read the Little House on a Prairie books. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't, maybe you've seen the television series. If you're like me, I grew up on both the books and watching the television series. Of course, that probably dates me quite a bit. But her life echoes the experiences of Laura Ingalls Wilder. Life as a farmer was not easy. She spent the early part of her marriage with her husband in a sod house. And you're probably going, what was a sod house? It's exactly what it sounds like. They dug a section of a hill out, and they essentially lived in the side of the house, in the side of the, pardon me, the side of the hill. And it was fraught with all the complications you would imagine of living in the side of a hill. And if you read the Laura Ingalls Wilder books about when they lived in a sod house, there were challenges and complications of living in that kind of life. But I imagine that Luna Kelly encountered the same kind of problems. And you can only imagine what it must have been like living there. But in addition, that it was a very cool place to live. Not cool in the sense of, wow, that was really fun, as much as it was insulated when you didn't have air conditioning, you didn't have heating, but it provided some temperature regulation that was provided by the natural insulation of the earth. Obviously, there wasn't much in the way of cross ventilation being the side of a hill, but it did provide that. But it also had some disadvantages, like when it rained, obviously the water seeped in through the dirt, and there was mud. It was very dirty, rough life. They barely scraped by. Also, again, something that echoed with the Ingalls family. Luna Kelly and her husband barely eked out a living. They encountered many hardships. The Ingalls family also encountered these complications. I imagine, even though it doesn't talk about it in your textbook, that Luna Kelly encountered many of the trials and tribulations that the Ingalls family did, of devastation by locusts, hardships of weather, of crops not coming in, those kind of things as well. And as the instead of the Grange, which is ultimately what Laura Ingalls Wilder's father became involved with, what eventually Luna Kelly becomes involved in is something called the Farmers Alliance. And the Farmers Alliance was very popular with women of the day because it allowed them to become politically active and to advocate for assistance And that's ultimately what she becomes very active in. And we'll talk more about the Farmers Alliance in this chapter and what exactly it did, and it allowed, it was kind of a way of getting farmers heard, and ultimately leads into the formation of something called the populists, which we'll be talking about as well. It was a cooperative enterprise, and ultimately Luna becomes the state secretary, and we'll be talking more about Luna as well, and ultimately about the Farmers Alliance. So let's go ahead and move into this chapter, because I know you want to learn more about this particular period of time, just as I like to talk about this particular period of time. So anyway, we're going to open up by talking about the elusive boundaries of male and female, and the Victorian construction of male and female in particular. Now, it's probably going to strike you as being odd, but for a long time, females were viewed as inferior, underdeveloped males. That probably strikes you as being odd, that for a long period of time, that's how the sexes were viewed. There wasn't this view that there were two sexes. Women were viewed as essentially underdeveloped males. It wasn't until after 1750 that the idea of opposite sexes really starts to set in, that there is such a thing as a male and a female. And then this idea sets in that men were active, competitive providers. They were rational. They were rational beings, but they also had insistent sexual drives. This is where this idea is going to come in, and we're going to talk about this, where they have this yearning, this burning sexual energy. And when we get to the Victorian era, there's going to be this need to repress this sexual, unrelenting sexual urge. During the Victorian era, this was considered almost unnatural. And this is going to be a shock for some of you. I'm sure you're all familiar with Kellogg's Corn Flakes. Would you believe that Kellogg's Corn Flakes was actually an invention during the Victorian era to try to bring the sexual urges of men in particular, and women as well, but primarily men, under control? And it was built on this idea of Sigmund Freud's controlling the sexual urges through your oral fixation. That if you crunched on something, that it would give you something to focus that sexual energy on. Yeah, Kellogg's Corn Flakes. It was actually developed by Dr. Kellogg. I'm sure you're all going, oh my word, I can't believe it. Innocent Kellogg's Corn Flakes, no longer innocent, yeah. Well, you're going to get another shock here. Graham crackers. Yes, folks, our favorite graham crackers that we give our young children. And I'm sure you've probably given young children graham crackers, and we built graham cracker houses at Christmas time with our little toddlers, and you're thinking, oh, how young, naive, and innocent, and how docile a graham cracker is. Would you have also believed that those were developed in the Victorian era, by the way, to deal with our sexual frustrations and energies? Again, the idea was to crunch on them, was to help you get out those sexual energies and deal with those sexual energies that were considered unhealthy and unnatural. Yeah, again, folks, I'm sorry. I'm destroying those wholesome, ideas of graham crackers and cornflakes. Yeah, sorry. Just what you needed, right? But yeah, that's where we come in with those things. Women were considered frail, cooperative, needed protecting, and lacked sexuality. Women were seen, this is where we get the idea of the weaker sex, the fragile sex. It's where we get this idea of because women menstruated, they were not supposed to expend their energies doing anything else. Reproduction was supposed to be the primary focus of a woman's energies. She was not supposed to pursue education. A woman's sole focus was supposed to be on bringing children into the world, focused on the home, the hearth, all these home-centric duties. She was not supposed to excite herself in any way. She was not seen as having the energies to get excitable. We get the ideas of the vapors. Women fainted a lot. Well, the reason women were fainting a lot was that the women were restrained in corsets and were dragging around bustles. I do a lot of dressing up in historic costumes for our museum, with the Colton Area Museum folks. And I will tell you that when you are gusseted up in a corset, dragging around a 15-pound bustle, you don't feel too hot. And then it's, say, anything above, say, 75, 80 degrees, you've got a really tight collar on, you start to feel pretty miserable. So I can imagine in those days, where the corsets were actually made of whalebone, which you figure the corsets were probably about, say, 15, 20 pounds in of themselves. Then maybe the bustle, you were lucky, the bustle was actually a pillow, which bustles were generally pillows. So you might get off light there. But then you have the fabrics, which could be heavy brocades, silks, satins. So you're adding another 20 pounds. Buttons. Then you have high button boots that you have to button. All said and done, a woman's all gusseted up like that. No wonder women were fainting. Then she's menstruating, she's losing blood, she's going through that, she's possibly anemic, not eating the best, well-balanced diet. Yeah, we don't want to get into that. And then they called women the weaker sex. Just saying, ladies and gentlemen, just saying. For anybody who's in medicine, also, corsets were notorious for deforming organs. We now realize this. The corsets and wearing corsets did deform internal organs for women. So that's another thing to take into consideration for any of you that are going into medicine. Whether you're going into emergency medical technicians, you're going into nursing, you're actually going into pre-med. You may want to study that or research that, what the effects that corset wearing had on the internal organs of women. It's fascinating stuff, really fascinating stuff. Yeah, pretty gruesome stuff. But I'm getting off topic. I always get off topic on these things totally fascinating to me. But you take my class, you'll realize that. Also, we have the role of medical profession in reproduction. Again, the medical profession becomes involved in reproduction at this point. We start to get this idea that, again, that women are inherently more fragile, more delicate, because of their capability of, obviously carrying a child, reproducing. They menstruate. There's the loss of blood, monthly loss of blood, all these ideas. They just don't have the physical capability as it is seen because of the medical profession, which is predominantly male, emphasizing this, that due to these stressful demands on their bodies, that they are incapable of doing anything other than reproducing. So that's another emphasis there as well. So we also have the moralist crusade for virtue and self-control going on as well. So cities broke down traditional morality. We have this idea that cities are these denizens of vice, these hotbeds of vice. They're these breeding grounds of prostitution and corruption and, sin. There's this wholesome image around the small town. But when you go into cities, that's where sin is. That's where the drinking, the gambling, the prostitution, this idea that everything bad is in the cities. And to some degree, there is stuff going on. But as we move into the teens and 20s, the turn of the century, we're going to start seeing that little towns have bad stuff going on in them too. It's not just isolated to the big cities. The little towns just know how to cover it up a little better than the big cities. Big cities, it's just kind of hanging out all over. And I'll tell you some stories about things that I learned when I worked out at a small town here in California at our archive, and I had some speculation about our little archive building that may have been what was called a blind pig, which was essentially a speakeasy, a concealed bar during Prohibition. We don't know that for fact, but everything kind of points in that direction that it may well have been, given what we know about a few details of the town and some other details. We suspect that may have been what it was. But anyway, Anthony Comstock was a big person in the government that pushed for the Society for the Suppression of Vice. This idea that we've got to keep vice out of mainstream. We've got to get rid of, things out of the mail. We've got to get things out of, our children's hands. It's the devil's weapon against, corrupting our youth. And he was pushing very strongly to do this. And was pretty successful, actually, with getting what was known as the Comstock Law passed, and the Comstock Act passed. He banned pornography, contraception, and abortion literature, and abortion, contraception, forms of contraception from being advertised in the mail. And we'll be talking later on about Margaret Sanger and also many of her articles and her literature that were banned under Comstock's measures. But even though abortion was banned, they were still accessible. We haven't quite reached this point in time in history where things get to the point where we are getting to the horrible back alley situation just yet. We're reaching that turning point, but we're not quite there yet. Probably just on the cusp. There are back alley abortions that are going on. What I mean by back alley abortions are the type that are jeopardizing women's lives. They are going on, but they will escalate once they are made to the point of they're criminalized. We'll see that happen. Contraception was illegal as well, but there were still ways of getting it. We'll be seeing how Margaret Sanger makes this push to try to get it legalized because of what she sees and what in her line of work as a nurse. We'll be talking about Margaret Sanger. But prostitution ultimately remains quite common. Obviously, the world's oldest profession, it remains very common. So, urban culture, it reflects the social changes that are going on in the United States at this time. The culture reflected the nostalgia for the past. We see Buffalo Bill being very popular, and if you're not familiar with Buffalo Bill had these Wild West reenactment shows that were lavish. They were amazing, full-scale performances that included cowboys, Indians, just essentially reenacting essentially what you'd see with a Wild West movie nowadays, but it was actually live. He would put on these massive shows. He would tour the country. Huge performances. He would actually hire on actual Native Americans to keep them from being put on reservations. Famous Native Americans to keep them from being put on the reservations or being punished by the government. So there's this nostalgia for this past. Also something else, Uncle Remus was a popular children's story. And if you haven't heard of Uncle Remus, interestingly enough, my mother is the one that told me about the Uncle Remus stories. And I was quite dumbstruck when I heard about the Uncle Remus stories because I was like, wow, really? So these are stories you grew up on. She was like, oh yeah, we read these stories. Oh, they weren't all that bad. And she said, my mother was told these stories, and these were common childhood stories. And I was like, oh, okay, wow, that's fascinating. But you had to realize the context by which these stories were popular. And what was so controversial and why it took me aback by it was Uncle Remus these stories were actually about plantation life. And it left me dumbstruck because they made plantation life and the happy slave stories, and that the South wasn't such a bad place and all this, and it was shocking for me. But these stories were stories that were popular with children and were part of the American narrative, if you can call it an American narrative. And it was astounding for me, quite astounding for me, to hear this. And it kind of took me back to hear my mother talking about these stories. And then I started researching, and I realized that Uncle Remus stories were popular stories. They were very popular, even though they celebrated a part of our heritage that obviously was very wrong. But they were very popular, as shocking as that is for us, obviously. So yeah, something we have to think about. Electricity led to the growth of nightlife. We have to realize that before we had the electric light bulb, which we all kind of take for granted, the only thing that they had to light the night were gas lamps. And if you've been to areas where they still have a few gas lamps around, you realize that the light put off by a gas lamp is very, very dim. It's not much of all. So when the electric light comes into play, it's a huge innovation. It's literally like the difference between, I hate to use this comparison, night and day. It makes a vast difference. People can continue to play into the darkness, and it does make that difference. People continue their activities well after dark, and they find that there are new venues and new things that they can do after dark that they couldn't do during the daytime, thanks to the electric light. And this changes the nightlife tremendously. And this is what we start to see emerging during this time period. And it also creates an idealization of sensuality. And what I mean by this is a dramatic change in vaudeville. If you've heard of vaudeville, vaudeville is the type of performance art that was popular, the stage art that was popular during this time. It's kind of like a variety show that went on, that people went and saw. And up until this time, it was pretty much kind of a slapstick, song and dance, family type thing. But it starts to get more sophisticated, very much more sophisticated, around this era. You start to see much more sensual, playing to a much more adult audience, because it starts to move into a nightlife element. And we start to see the introduction of something of a new genre, which is burlesque. And with burlesque comes the striptease. This introduction of this, and what I mean by striptease is I'm not talking about the strippers you see now with pole dancing and that kind of thing. This is a whole different thing that is vastly different. This is something entirely different. I'm talking about, tame striptease, very, very modest striptease that gives more suggestion than anything. very different. But anyway, it is much more demure, much more illusion than skin. But it changes sensuality dramatically. But anyway, we're going to end here with our first part of this lecture, and we will start up with our next part of the lecture after this. So I hope you've enjoyed this first part.